Hello and welcome to my session. This is Critical Thinking and Collaborative Learning, Strategies for Interpreting Educators. My name is Rebecca Conrad Adams. I will be the facilitator for this discussion, and I want to welcome you all to this session. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with me. I know that you are virtual listeners, that you're not here with me right now, but I look forward to reading your responses and engaging with you after you've completed this recording. First off, today we'll be using Blackboard Ultra Collaborate to facilitate our discussion. You can join the session here. This is the link right here, as you can see. If you could just go ahead and click that link and join our session. When you receive the original page, the home page of Ultra, you'll go ahead and type in your preferred name, and then afterward you can check your video and audio settings along the bottom. You can do that right here. This would be your audio, and this of course will be your video. There are some other tools that we will get into as we go along, but for right now, those are the two that we would be needing to discuss with one another, the topic that we have at hand. Before we get started, I ask that you make sure that there are no distractions and that you have ample time set aside to fully participate with the activities that we are going to be doing. And as we prepare to get ready, just a few reminders of no pets, no cats, dogs, birds, snakes, anything. Make sure that your time is set aside to pay full attention to the module at hand. I also ask that we set time aside by turning off phones or any kind of other distractions, text messaging, anything like that, and making sure that we have space set aside by maybe closing the door and giving yourself some privacy. Next, we'll be doing a communication check. As I mentioned before, the tools for that are at the bottom of the screen. There is a microphone. It's the small circle to the right of your picture, and then right next to that, there's a video in case you'd like to have a video feed. After you can ensure that those are both working, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to begin this module with the thought of being on the shoulders of giants and thinking within our field of interpreting whom the giants are. So I'd like you to go ahead and take a quick minute here to post a short reflection within the discussion board of giant within Pilot. Describe who your giant is or was and why that person was so meaningful to you. What did they do specifically for you that made them a giant in your mind? And when you think of them, what really comes to mind as far as their education or their part in your education? Then take a moment after you've recorded your response to look at others and their responses and try to see if there's any similarities. Does anybody have the same giant that has really made a big impact on our field? So that's something I'd like you to go ahead and take a minute and just go ahead and respond to these questions here at hand. Go ahead and respond to these within the discussion board, and feel free to just think about that for a minute and then come back when you're ready. Next, this is one of my giants. This is Betty Kalanimis. She is a legend in our field and has led plenty of workshops for people who are practicing interpreters, interpreter educators, and has made a big difference in my own personal life and professional life. I'd like you to take a minute to just go ahead and watch this video. It's in the chat box. I'll be posting that here in just a second for you all to go ahead and get familiar with. You can go ahead and take a moment to see her response and see what she is remarking when she's speaking about brave spaces. I'm going to go ahead and post this in the chat box. and ask you to go ahead and take a look at that. Go ahead and watch the link and then share some of your thoughts. Go ahead and jot those down. And the chat for everyone to know is on the bottom right hand of the screen. You can see that here. This purple box. If you click that, you'll see it expand. And then once you get there, you can see right here where I'm pointing with the pointer is the little dialog box that you can hit to chat. Next up, talking about our learning objectives. We have 3 learning objectives for this session. First of all, we will be explaining the 4-step process of critical thinking and providing examples from our classrooms. Secondly, we'll be justifying the importance of community and collaborative learning. And thirdly, we'll be talking about how participants can compare collaboration and competition in education and sharing examples of how competition can be avoided. So those are the 3 things we're keeping in mind as we go through our discussion. First off, we'll start with a small icebreaker. I'd like to know what you know about critical thinking. So what I'm going to have you do for all those listening is go ahead and post within the discussion board on Pilot that's titled All About Us, an experience that you feel allowed you to think critically. What was that like? What did you notice? That should be just a few sentences on any memory that you might have of a time that you thought that you were really feeling like you were thinking critically and what steps you might have taken. Secondly, I'd like you to think about what learning collaboratively looks like. And what I'd like you to do is find an image that you'll post under your previous response that kind of matches the mental picture that you get when someone says collaborative learning. What is the first image that comes to your mind? If you could just find an image that fits with that, it can be clip art, it can be something that you get from Google. Either way, just go ahead and post that image underneath your previous response. And then after that, we'll take a moment just to respond to a few others' responses. And then again, noticing if there's any similarities among what you said and what another person may have responded. So go ahead and pause the recording, take just a few minutes to go ahead and do those 3 steps and come back when you're ready. So when we're thinking about critical thinking, specifically how it relates to education, we really have to think about critical thinking as a process. So thinking about that, there are 4 parts to the process. It's identification, exploration, integration, and resolution. And essentially what that is it's a process of inquiry where one begins with identifying a problem or something that they feel needs further thought or needs further exploration, which leads to the next part of exploration in the process where students or inquirers will seek out some information that can lead them to some kind of solution for this problem. Just creating new ideas. This could be discussing with colleagues. This could be doing formal research. This could be doing an experiment, but that leads to integration where one has taken what they've learned and found throughout this process and try to integrate it with the problem that they've identified. So finding additional pieces of information that lead them to a conclusion that they're able to resolve within their life. So taking those skills that they've learned, that piece of information, and applying it to their own personal or professional life. And that is the skill of resolution. So take a moment now to think about when you might have followed this process. Try to identify a specific time where you might have gone through those 4 steps, and if there were any other steps that you may have encountered or any kind of looping back because they're not necessarily in that order, but thinking of how things like that may have occurred. Take a moment just to jot down a specific situation that you may have experienced that is very similar to this. Next up, there is the idea of deep learning requiring community. And when we're talking about specifically critical thinking that leads to deep learning, we need other people to be a part of that. So as I mentioned, there's the exploration and there is also the integration, and both of those require a community of people, that there's a discussion that's taking place, that discourse is happening, and discourse cannot happen just with one individual for someone to learn. So thinking that our learning is situated within social structures, including our classrooms, we have to realize that we are learning from one another. Not only are we learning from our teachers, but we're also learning from our fellow students, which is a great opportunity for us as educators to begin forming future leaders. So I'd like you to take a time to think about when you may have learned from another student. What lesson did you learn, and why has that stuck with you? Why was it such an important idea for you to learn from another student? Go ahead and take a moment, stop the recording, and once you're done, come back, but take a minute to think about how you were able to learn from another student. Next up is the idea that communities should not include competition. Essentially, what this means is that we are building a community which is everybody on equal footing, that it's a process of inquiry that's not individualistic, that while students and individuals are finding individual meaning by integrating that learned knowledge into their own lives and creating shared meaning from that, it is shared meaning, that it is collective, and that it's being done as a group rather than individually. This also means that we're responsible for our own learning and that we are being assessed on how much we're integrating into our own personal lives rather than focusing on competition through grading or any other external measures of success. The goal is to focus on oneself and the contributions that you're making to the contributions that you're making to the actual conversations that are taking place and what we're trying to study and learn. So write about a time that you felt competition took place over collaboration in a shared space. Why did you feel that way? And if you could go back in time, what would you do to change the focus from competition to collaboration? So go ahead and take a moment there and write down what you thought, what you felt in that experience, and how that shaped who you are as an educator now. So go ahead and pause the recording. Now, we're going to talk about turning theory into practice, so brainstorming some ideas that we can use for the classroom specifically, as we're a group of educators working with interpreting students, taking some of that shared understanding of what critical thinking and collaborative learning look like and applying those to the actual classrooms where we are teaching our students. Firstly, thinking how we can evaluate our students on the critical thinking process. So we talked about critical thinking being a process of those 4 steps, and thinking about how we can mesh that with the curriculum that we're using now. One particular activity that we've used over the last few years has been the skill enhancement activity. And that's a chance for students to sort of identify a problem that they're struggling with and begin those first steps of exploring what options they have to try to build their skill and become better interpreters. So I'd like you to go ahead and write about one way you've seen a student work through those 4 steps of critical thinking. That's here, this part. So working through those 4 steps of identification, exploration, integration, and resolution, how did that student specifically work through those 4 steps? What did you observe? And at the end, this part here, what did they seem to gain? So what did they gain from that process specifically? Nextly, I'm going to ask you to create a sample skill enhancement activity. Like I mentioned, we use the skill enhancement activity with our students, but I'd like you to just go ahead and write the first 2 steps. So create a sample skill enhancement activity. So for example, maybe focusing on a student who's really struggling with fingerspelling. That seems to be a very common problem that our students experience. So if they were saying that, I'm having a problem with fingerspelling, go ahead and write the first 2 steps of that process. So they would be beginning with the identification that they have an issue with fingerspelling, and they'd be exploring other options to try to better their fingerspelling comprehension or skill. Then I'd like you to go ahead and share that with your peers here in the discussion board labeled SEA. That's in Pilot, so go ahead and do that now. Next, moving along, creating communities. As we mentioned, learning doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a situated practice within a community. And we do have groups of students that are working together, but thinking about how they can work together even more collaboratively during a practicum session. So I'd like you to go ahead and create a sample problem that students can work together to discuss during a practicum session. So for example, knowing that Ohio has no licensure law regarding interpreting standards, what are skills interpreters should cultivate as professionals? Why are these important? That would be a sample problem that students could discuss and work together. They could do some research, examining literature. They could get in touch with practice professionals. They could also get in touch with deaf community members to see what are those skills that interpreters should cultivate. And they could do some discussion, brainstorming to figure out why those are important. So I'd like you to go ahead and pause the recording and jot down some of your ideas. Go ahead and share that with your colleagues in the discussion board that's labeled critical thinking, and get some feedback from other educators. I'd also like you to bear in mind while you're doing this activity that while we are creating communities, there may not be perfect consensus when students are coming to the resolution point. And what that means is that there may not be agreement among students. However, they're still engaging in that process. They're able to create meaningful shared understanding amongst one another, although they might not agree on the final product, on the final skills. For example, in this example, maybe students might disagree on what skills they feel are meaningful or necessary for interpreters. They should still be engaging in that same process, working collectively together. So go ahead and take a minute to jot down those ideas, post them into the discussion board, and come back when you're ready. Thirdly, there's also the idea that collaboration will always trump competition. As we mentioned before, there's not really much place within a community for competition. Competition tends to kill the motivation for working together as a group, and unfortunately, it can create sort of a hierarchy where there's not much equality or equity when it comes to sharing ideas or discussing ideas, as one person might dominate a discussion. One person might say, well, I get all A's and you get all C's, so my ideas are more valid than your own. So when thinking about that, one tip is to steer away from using grades. I know that we use a lot of grading and rubrics within our courses, but thinking of another way that we can provide feedback to students without using grades. So I'd like you to go ahead and put on your thinking caps and create an alternative assessment that does not include a letter grade. So no A's, no B's, C's, anything. So none of that. I'm going to write this to be very emphatic. No grades. No grades. But think of another way that we as educators can provide necessary and personalized feedback to our students without using grades. So I'd like you to go ahead and create an idea of an alternative assessment that does include a letter grade. And this can be done using a multitude of methods, multitude of modes, including visual or kinesthetic modes. So smiley faces, thumbs up, anything like that that you can think of that might be helpful for students without creating a culture of competition that might otherwise be presented by using letter grades. Go ahead and brainstorm some ideas. Go ahead and post the idea in the discussion board labeled feedback. Then read some other people's responses and kind of decide for yourself, like which ones do you think that you'd be comfortable using within the classroom, why or why not. So go ahead and pause the recording, make your discussion board post, and come back when you're ready, thinking about what other responses that you might be able to use within your own classroom. To sum things up, we started by saying that there are giants in our field and that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are engaged in this process of critical thinking and learning collaboratively, which we've been doing for centuries as interpreters. We've been learning from this heritage of the ones who came before. We're the ones right now who are putting our students on our shoulders. So as the slide says, it's time to inspire, it's time to get excited, it's time to really start thinking about what we can do to make a difference in the classroom. And remembering, critical thinking is a process. We're taking things one step at a time. We're identifying, exploring, integrating, and resolving. These are all of the 4 steps that students will be within the classroom and that we will be engaged in as the educator facilitating the session. Secondly, we'll be remembering that learning requires community and is situated within a particular space and time and requires active engagement with others to create meaning. We'll be thinking about what it means to build a community and how we can sustain that community as we walk through those 4 processes that we already mentioned. And lastly, teamwork makes the dream work. This is one of my favorite sayings because I think that it's very true, especially when it comes to interpreting and how much we collaborate with one another and act as teams. So learning community should not include competition and should instead foster collaboration. So as you're moving on, as you're going back to the classrooms, as you're coming back after the holiday and getting ready to teach, I want you to think very deeply about what that means. That instead of having competition, instead of using letter grades, that instead we're fostering collaboration and how we can continue to do that both among our students and among ourselves as working, practicing professionals. At this time, are there any questions for me? Any questions? Or for each other. If not, we are nearing the end of the module, so I'd like to thank you all for coming and watching this video. I know that you're not with me here now, but thank you so much for taking the time. Go ahead and share your feedback on this presentation through the thread in Pilot. There's a discussion board titled Blackboard Ultra Feedback. Go ahead and share some ways that you think this presentation can be improved upon. I really look forward to your feedback and look forward to hearing more from you. Have a good night.